I don't think this man actually needs an introduction. If I base that on the number of people who've said to me today, we are so excited to see your session with David this afternoon. Everybody clearly already knows who you are and some of the incredible work you do. But I think it's really interesting for us to have somebody on stage this afternoon who, to a certain extent, performs in the same art as we do. You take stories, you take evidence, you take information, and you use narrative to help that preventive point of view, to influence people to show something. So obviously historian, broadcaster, writer, journalist. I didn't bring it on stage. My son has actually read the illustrated edition of Black and British: A Forgotten History. So if people haven't read that, or might have seen you on A House Through Time. But where I would really like to start, David, is this idea of kind of using voices and using individual people to help tell a story. And for me, reading Black and British, one of the things that actually hit me quite strongly was that kind of coming together of so many stories and so many voices. And I'd love you to kind of talk a little bit about how you see the role of voices in bringing history to people now, and how they see the role of that.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I was reflecting, I was talking to some historians recently about the history of slavery, and we were discussing what was the most important book in the history of slavery. And I very strongly think I'm right, and I know the answer. And the answer is Roots, which is the story, and a very, very flawed story, of an individual. It's not any of the great history books, any of the great analysis, any of the books that actually, in an intellectual way, transformed our understanding of the history of slavery. It is a book that then became a TV series that told a very, very simple, although factually flawed, narrative of a family. And it worked in a way that history books tend not to work. It worked through the personal, through the individual, and through that urge that we have, that sort of comfort we feel with narrative. And one of the great problems that I think many academics and many fields of academia face is that we've turned our back on story. We think analysis, debate, and the application of theory to information is what is regarded as scholarship. That's quite a modern idea, and I think it's been quite a damaging idea. And at the very moment when I think we need scholarship, we need academics more than ever, this retreat to theory, this retreat to analysis, and this fixation with having a specialized argot, a specialized code that is not accessible to others, this was the worst possible time for academics to make themselves hard to understand. We need data, we need analysis, we need depth of thinking more than ever. And this retreat from story, I think, has been deeply damaging. So I see my job, when I gave my inaugural lecture, when I became professor at Manchester University, I described myself as a connective circuit between the academic world and the world of popular history, and my title is Professor of Public History. And I like that idea of being a bit of connective circuitry, but I'm only needed because of that rejection of story and the story of individuals as vehicles through which to tell bigger stories.
And I've heard you say before that something that you feel quite strongly is this idea of caring about the people whose stories you're telling. And I think often in our profession, we worry about the bias that might bring, that actually if you care about them, are you coming at it from a perspective that's wanting to support a point of view, and how do we be objective in the stories we're telling and the data we're presenting? How do you approach that idea of kind of having that balance between objectivity and caring, or actually is objectivity not important?
Well, I think objectivity is important, but so is caring. And I have to be careful here because I can make myself sound like a weirdo. But I really believe in trying to commune with the dead when it comes to history. That my job is to make other people care about the lives of people who lived and died before they were born. And the first necessary precursor, the foundation upon which that can be done, is if I care myself. And if I don't care, I believe people can see, and I believe people don't invest in the histories that I'm trying to engage them with. So I really make myself care. So I make a series called A House Through Time, and in the first series I will find out where the characters are buried, and I will go to their graves. My first book was about a German genocide in Namibia, 1904 to 1908. Extermination of 2 indigenous groups. There are mass graves in which the bodies have come to the surface. This is a desert. The bodies come to the surface, and me and my co-author we went and sat in a mass grave surrounded by the bones of our victims, and we made a promise to tell their stories, a kind of lifelong pact, which we have adhered to. Now that does, as I said, make me sound like a weirdo. But I don't think I have a right to stand on television with license payers' money and appeal to other people to care about history if I'm not invested myself. But I guess where I think where I worry less about this idea between balance and investment is you can be very invested in someone's story and still be critical of them. And I think the idea that that's a binary, you either invest in people, you care about them, or you are analytical of them, I think that's a false binary. And let me give you an example. One of the central figures in my book, Black and British, is Granville Sharp, who was a remarkable figure from a remarkable family in 18th century London, who in 1865 encountered a boy we think was 15 or 16, Jonathan Strong, who'd been beaten almost to death. He was an enslaved person, left to die on the streets. Granville Sharp then spent pretty much the rest of his life fighting against slavery. He in some ways confected the Great Somerset case, which led to the 1772 decision that slavery was illegal in Britain, and that was the first legal decision against slavery that was one of the stepping stones towards abolition. Granville Sharp is a truly remarkable people. I've read all of his documents. I know I've met his descendants. But Granville Sharp believed in ancient, ridiculous biblical explanations for human, physical, racial difference. Now, I can admire and invest in the story of Granville Sharp and still be able to point out that his thinking was infected in all sorts of ways by 18th century religious and pseudoscientific racism. And I guess I don't see the difficulty. And I think that the reason I don't see the difficulty is because underpinning that is a rejection of one of the things that historians and history in this country and others have taken it upon themselves to make their job, which is the generation and defense of heroes. I'm profoundly opposed to the concept of heroes. The idea of heroes, which underpins the whole idea of statues, is that we secede judgment. We stop judgment about someone, we stop analysis. Once someone is given heroic status, they are beyond analysis, beyond judgment. I completely reject that. I know people in my life who I admire, and I can still see their flaws. We all do. Those of us who try for some self-awareness can see our own flaws. I think you can be invested in people, living or dead, and still be able to analyze them, still be able to step back, still be able to be an impartial, analytical voice.
I think that leads me on to another area, which is this idea of kind of what is truth and what is perspective. And actually a lot of the time in narrative, we are presenting a point of view, we are presenting a perspective. And I think where it comes through in Black and British is actually throughout history, from the various early recordings of it. People have presented, and in this case looking at kind of how black people have been presented, there's been all kinds of ridiculous stuff put forward. So, people in Africa have got 3 eyes and, all of this. But it's there, and it's something that's printed and something that people invest in, and you take that through to kind of the 1950s, 1960s, and Enoch Powell talking. And there's lots of people who use the power of their narrative and their perspective to influence people and influence people's judgment. And I think it feels like you're almost using the power of, you're giving those other people voice now to combat that narrative that's had a louder voice for quite a long period of time.
I think that's true, but I think there's something, I'd like to think, something deeper going on. I mean, there are 2 forms of black history, and I'd like to think that I engage in both, and they're both legitimate. One of them, which I think is the part which politicians tend to be comfortable with, which is about, it centers around one word, contribution. And it is about showing that black people, and there are similar histories for Asian people and other people from different parts of the world, they played a role in our story, that they have a presence. There's been black people living in this city continually since the 18th century. That's an entirely valid history, that there were black sailors at Trafalgar, black soldiers in the trenches of the First World War, black airmen in the bombers of the Second World War. But there's another form of black history, which is about the development and the emergence and the evolution of the race idea. And that form of history is one that we are much, much less comfortable with. And the reason that history is really valid is because those ideas are not just of interest or importance to historians, because those ideas live on. And the reason to study these ideas and their evolution is because we can, and researchers have shown and demonstrated how they operate within our society today. Let me give you an example. I mean, one of the ideas, the slave-owning lobby in the British Empire, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, and in the United States were particularly keen to propagate, to imprint into documents, to make unassailable, was the idea that black people have a different relationship to pain to white people. And you can find these arguments in the literature of all of those empires and the United States. You can find it from the 18th century to the 20th century, that black people feel pain less than white people. Now, if you are running a system based on exemplary violence, overwork, and the whip, you can see why you would want to pretend that the people who you are abusing do not feel pain, and therefore it does not matter that you're abusing them. Now, I can point you to documents from all of those empires, from all of those centuries that put forward these arguments. I can show how the same false claims are made in different places at different times. One of the most common claims that is made in this literature is doctors, and the medical profession is at the center of this, claiming to have carried out operations or amputations upon black people who did not require anesthesia. The father of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims, devised techniques that are used today by doctors sorry, this is brutal and horrible, but by carrying out operations on enslaved black women without anesthesia, some of whom died. Now, it would be wonderful, in a way, if those documents had no relevance to the present day, but we know that right now in this city, in cities across Europe, in cities in America, black people in hospitals are being prescribed pain at a lower rate than white people today. And the doctors doing it, doctors are the best people in our society, don't know they're doing it. They're doing it because ideas, stereotypes, and beliefs have subconsciously worked their way into the fabric of our society to the extent that we carry them subconsciously. Now, understanding how ideas that powerful that can influence the best people in our society to do things that are against the interests of the people that they exist to serve, that is, I think, there's nothing more important I think historians can do than demonstrate that. And so the ways in which opinions, the ways in which theories can not just become established as fact, but can become culturally ingrained to the extent that they operate subconsciously, is one of the reasons why I think that the study of the race idea is as important as the study of the contribution of black people. I mean, on those issues about pain perception, black people themselves, in repeated studies, underrate their own pain. Black children, in a study of 2014 called Dorr et al., underrated their own pain relative to that of white children. So this is not just white people. This is, in some ways, one of the great problems with people's understanding of race is when we keep thinking it's about good people and bad people. These ideas are so powerful that they've been internalized by everybody, including the people that they harm.
And that's one of the things that I still struggle to process, kind of, you know, reading some of the stuff that you've written. And I was talking to, we've got an internal kind of belonging group within the company I work for. And I was talking to got somebody called Tyra, who's one of our software engineers, and she grew up mixed race in the Midlands. And she recalls when she was 12, and she's young, she's in her 20s, when she was at the age of 12, seeing advertising materials for the BNP Youth talking about how mixed race children are a victim of their parents. Like, that's current day. And actually, you read about some of that thinking from a long time ago, and you go, well, people have moved on from that. But actually, that's the thing that still I can't quite compute, is how ingrained it is that people are still quite happily willing to kind of believe those things and believe that people are lesser than other people because of the colour of their skin.
And I think the fact that they're so pervasive, those ideas, means that there's a greater onus to understand their history. I mean, the European Social Survey, that the studies of attitudinal surveys of attitudes towards race, the 2019 study asked people whether they thought it was true that some races are more intelligent than others. Now, you know, it was very positive that 81% of people in that survey rejected that idea, but 19% believe in it. Now, it's shocking that it's 19%, but I think it's even more shocking if we recognize that these ideas of racial biological difference, the correlation between cognitive abilities and this thing we call race, this social construct, I think it's equally important to not just worry about the fact that it's 19% of our population that believe those ideas, but also to understand that those ideas themselves are 300 years old. And that those ideas, to be there in 2019, to be picked up by a survey, have had to transmit themselves like a virus from generation to generation to generation. The things you read in documents in the 18th century are not trapped in the 18th century. The ideas of Edward Long, the ideas of Nott and Gliddon, the ideas of all of these racial theorists, they are, I would love it if they were only of interest or significance to people like myself who study the past. The reason we need to understand the not just attitudes, but the roots of attitudes, that there is a narrative and a trajectory behind that narrative, is because I don't think we can properly address these things until we understand just how old they are, how pervasive they are. And that journey to understand the origins of ideas reveals something else, which is that these ideas didn't emerge. They didn't just evolve. They were built. They were constructed deliberately and purposefully by some of the most sophisticated and well-funded political and economic lobby groups the world has ever seen. These ideas exist in the 21st century because they were put there, because it was in the interests of certain economic groups to put those ideas there. So we sometimes get confused that this is kind of like innate prejudice. This is not. This is a system of belief that was deliberately and purposefully invented and propagated, not just through science or medical science or through politics, but through popular culture. It has infected our society for centuries. And people who are interested in writing about Black history and race, and not just the contribution, part of our job is to try to alert us to, if we are going to fight these ideas, we need to understand how they were built. If you were going to demolish anything, going to demolish a building in this city, the first thing you'd want are the blueprints. Well, the blueprints of the ideas against which we're fighting lie on the pages of historical documents and books.
Which points to the fact that it needs a lot more than what is going on at the moment to try and unpack that and to try and undo that. There's kind of reparations and all these kinds of stuff that are happening, but like to address those really fundamental societal, cultural things, like huge things need to happen to counter that.
They do, and this is where historians can't help, and it's up to politicians. But I think, if I take to stay on the example of pain, the work that's been done by researchers and statisticians over recent years to show the disparity in outcomes for Black women in this society, 4 to 5 times more likely to die in childbirth or the 6 weeks after. I think that's one of the few metrics that's cut through, that has become part of popular understanding for many people. What historians can do is point out that that itself is part of the history of this pain perception mythology invented in the 17th, 18th centuries. I was born at a moment when those myths about pain were manifested. My mother is white British. I was born in Nigeria in 1970. My mother was the only white woman on the ward. And when I was born, and my mother was taken back to the ward, the doctors, so the nurses, Nigerian Black nurses, took the fans off a Black woman who'd had a cesarean and who was in pain and put them on my mother because my mother was white. And my mother freaked and demanded they put the fans back on the Black woman. But Black African nurses were so confident of the belief that white people experience pain more acutely than Black people that they took the fans off a Black woman. So these ideas, literally at the moment of my birth, those ideas were manifest. So it's really valuable and really important that researchers can use these metrics and demonstrate how these ideas are operating. But I think there needs to be a backfill of historians to show that we can never really fully understand these ideas if we only understand how they operate now.
Yeah. Which makes some of the jobs that we're trying to do as a sector, as individual organisations and businesses, there is a real strong will among people in this room and people kind of in the sector more generally to try and make changes, to try and be more inclusive, to try and kind of address some of the kind of diversity challenge we're facing. The societal issues are very big. How can we approach things within business, within organisations, to try and start to do more than we have done in the past? And, again, talking to people who are, a Black Women in Tech event last week for International Women's Day, there are people who are blocked daily in their jobs because they're a Black woman, and the experience they're having are still visceral and still real and still impacting how people are progressing in their careers. How can we start to unpack that within our organisations to address some of these issues in a really small way?
Well, I think there's two things, and one of them's easier, and one of them's more difficult. I think the easier thing is to try to recognise that racial thinking, like other forms of bias thinking, normalizes the abnormal. We get used to the way things are, and that becomes, by exposure, what is normal. Let me give you an example. I have insomnia. I've had it my whole life, and my doctor, who's one of the least sympathetic people I've ever met, her attitude was that because my work is flexible, so if your work is flexible, then insomnia is not a problem. If you can't sleep, go to work. And so in my 20s and 30s, I used to get on my bike, cycle to the office, and I'd get there at 5 o'clock in the morning. If I felt tired, I could leave at 3, it was fine. And I could adjust, and then the insomnia would go. And that experience was really informative, because at 5 o'clock in the morning in a television office in London or Bristol, everyone looked like me. Everyone was Nigerian, or they were from Sudan, or later they were from Iraq. By 8 o'clock, I was the only non-white person in the building. We've completely normalized the fact that the people who cleaned the office were not white, and the people who worked in the office were white, and nobody noticed. We walk into buildings in this city and walk from a diverse world into a monotonal world, and people don't notice. The idea that the boardroom would be entirely white and the post room would be entirely not white, again, we almost don't notice it. The workforce of this city is 36.6%. Not white. I've never walked into a boardroom in this city, and I've been to a lot of boardrooms where more than a third of the people around the table aren't white. Never set foot on a TV production or a film production where a third of the people are not white, even when the subject is about Black people. That would just be normality. 1 in 3 people being not white in any of those circumstances would merely be normality. But that would seem abnormal because our exposure to abnormality has made it, has normalized it. So I think recognizing that, and it's an uncomfortable thing to recognize, far more uncomfortable, I think, is the real challenge, which is we need to recognize and be honest with ourselves about the fact that we, despite ourselves, can incubate these ideas, and we can act in ways that are damaging to people around us because we have imbibed the attitudes and cultures of our society. You have to be a real fanatical libertarian to believe that we are the conscious authors of every thought that passes through our mind. You have to reject everything we know about how our minds actually work at a biological level to believe that. We are enormously influenced in our subconscious by the society that we are acculturated to. I would like to believe that my conscious feminism means I have always behaved in a way that would be reflective of those conscious beliefs towards every woman I've ever worked with. I suspect that's not the case. I'd love to think the opposite. And it's embarrassing admitting that. But embarrassment isn't the issue. The issue is you cannot actually avoid impacting other people unless you make those recognitions. I had an experience a few years ago where one of those rare moments when your conscious catches your subconscious. I was interviewing on an interview panel, and I found myself tuning out listening to one of the female candidates. She has a woman with a northern accent. I was brought up by a single parent woman with a northern accent, so I'm not somebody who's prone to consciously dismissing women with northern accents. But I found myself just not giving her the attention and the credence I'd given her predecessor, who was a white, privately educated man. And my consciousness caught my subconscious. Now, that is even more embarrassing to admit to you here today. But again, my embarrassment isn't the issue. Because her right to be interviewed and judged on her skills and abilities, track record and CV is far more important than any nonsense floating around in my subconscious picked up in the 70s or something when I was a kid. Recognizing that we can incubate these ideas subconsciously, and we can, without meaning to, create attitudes, systems, circumstances, cultures that undermine the chances and the life opportunities of our colleagues and fellow citizens. That's a really hard thing to do because we don't like admitting this. I would much rather say, oh, I've seen through all of this and I never behave in a way that is in any way impacted by those beliefs. It's not true. Yeah. Good people, really good people, like doctors who underprescribe pain relief, can act in ways, follow synaptic pathways to really biased and damaging outcomes.
So therefore, the more we can make it an active part of our conscious brain, the more likely we are then to be able to do what you did, is to catch our subconscious.
But we have to talk about it. And that's the really hard thing. As I said, I found that embarrassing, admitting that to you. But unless we talk about it, unless we admit and recognize and are vocal when those things happen, when we catch ourselves, and also when others pointed out, not go to the place we want to go, which is defensiveness, and find the strength instead to be open, then I think we have real problems, because that's what it requires. Self-analysis, self-criticism are things that we don't rush to as human beings. I mean, it is literally no fun. But I think that's the big ask if we really want a more equitable society.
It's a really interesting challenge, because one of the things we talk about a lot in the sector again is, what we're doing around mental well-being and the importance of business leaders being vulnerable and open up to kind of admitting that they too face challenges in this. I think it's probably a lot harder if you're a white, middle-aged male business leader sitting in this room to go, you know what, I sat in that interview and I tuned out of that person that I was interviewing a job because they were black or because they were Asian. Like, that's a really hard thing for people to start opening up and have those conversations. So I think it's an interesting challenge for us to think about how we can actually enable and support people to do that. We need to have almost an amnesty that we need to allow people to admit to those mistakes in order to move through them.
Yeah. And I think that's the real challenge, and some of the things which worries me about certain debates is that it is, I don't feel much compassion. I don't feel much room for mistakes and admission. I mean, the idea that you can be on a trajectory and you can be open about the fact that you're on a journey from a place that was more problematic, I think it's very hard to admit to that. Though I've seen real significant leaders in business do exactly that. One of the things that I found most remarkable in my experience working with lots of businesses in the consultancy role is reverse mentorship. And the people who have gone through that, and it is almost like a sort of conversion experience, people are almost zealot-like when they've experienced it. They will talk about their previous thought patterns and what they've learned subsequent to that experience. So I have met people and I've watched people go on a trajectory in which they do feel able to have those conversations and be open about the journey that they've been on.
I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, the wider kind of cultural world that we live in. And you gave MacTaggart lecture at the Television Festival in Edinburgh a few years ago, where you talked very openly about the things that you were seeing and the things that you were experiencing, that you were like, it's not doing this in the right way. There's not enough of the right kind of representation on television. Do you think that is on a trajectory? Do you think that is moving in a direction where we are seeing more of the kind of representation that's going to help us move forwards and kind of having that, I guess, that something that's becoming more normal to see black people or people from different backgrounds in the right kind of situations, that we're not minimizing who they are and how they're represented?
I think one of the real challenges where I don't see a huge amount of progress is, I think we need to ask ourselves, when people are present and when they are celebrated, to what extent does their story and their narrative challenge the ideas of race that emerged in past centuries? This is not to detract at all from black performers, but race always said black people could be performers. And the race idea as it emerged said that black people were physical. They could sing and dance, they were of the soul, they were of the body, they were physical, they didn't feel pain, remember, to the same way as white people. They were stronger, arguably, than white people. Race was always comfortable with that. What it said was that people of African heritage had a diminished capacity for cognitive analytical intelligence. Now, everybody in this room can name 10 black athletes. Everyone can name 10 black performers. 10 black intellectuals? I don't think most people can do. I think African Americans probably can. This is not to detract, as I said, from anyone's achievements, but I think there is a subconscious, black people are allowed to succeed and do succeed in the areas where the race idea already said they could succeed. And so I'm more pleased to see black politicians, even ones I profoundly disagree with, than I am more black performers. And again, it's not to detract from their abilities. It's that we really need to recognize these ideas are operating in our society today. And people are, I mean, in my experience as a TV producer and a presenter, is that my industry's always been much more comfortable with me in a performative than a managerial or administrative role. And I constantly find myself asking people to ask themselves why they're comfortable with me in that capacity and not the other capacity. There are people who are perfectly comfortable with black people as colleagues, but they wouldn't be as bosses. Some of them only discover that when they get a black boss. So the recognizing that these ideas, they weren't always simply hierarchies. It was about ascribing certain people certain arenas in which they could succeed and certain arenas in which they couldn't. And if you think about what black people have achieved in the areas where they were always prescribed to, the body, art, the soul, and then think about how much our society is denied, how much our society is impoverished by the areas in which black people were historically excluded. Imagine, look at what black people have done for sport. Imagine what they could do for the intellectual life if we didn't have these toxic ideas from past centuries.
Interesting. I want to move on, because our time is ticking down really quickly, to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we have within the sector. So, it is really important when we are representing the voices of the public, the voices of consumers, that we are representing the audience that might be. Up until embarrassingly recently, the idea of kind of having ethnicity as a category when we're trying to define a nationally representative sample wasn't there. It wasn't a thing. There's a lot of work that's gone in to try and introduce that. And there was a panel discussion earlier where Kenny, who's just there, talked about the idea kind of that often as a minority person, you feel othered by ticking a category that's outside the mainstream. And I'd just be interested to get your perspectives on how we use categorization and labels and segmentations. Does that somehow perpetuate some of these feelings? Because actually we're putting white people into this box here and we're putting black people into another box there, and we have to kind of, how do we address that in a way that is meaningful and truly inclusive and not just ticking a box to say, there we go, we've done it?
Well, in some ways I'd want to make the case for the power of ticking boxes, because I think we have all sorts of crude designations and methods of chopping up society to make it easier to analyse. And I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with them. But I think the alternative of not having those metrics, well, we know what that looks like, because 26 miles from our shores, there's a huge field experiment called France, where that's being carried out, where France, because race is not in the constitution, France officially is a society where race doesn't exist, where these metrics that allow us to see advantage and disadvantage, progress or lack of progress, are retarded by an official rejection of that form of analysis and categorization. And I'd much rather have to tick an unwieldy form and come up with some weird acronym to describe me than live in France. I mean, we know the statistics for things like stop and search. I mean, the foods would be another way to think about it, but the stop and search figures for black people in Britain, black French guys in the banlieue in Paris, it's so much worse. But there's no metrics. I was talking to a French TV executive a few months ago, and he said the equivalent view in France doesn't exist. There isn't black French historians on television, black TV presenters. Now, there are some, but what he's speaking to is the truth. So I guess I understand people's sensitivities about those categorizations, but I really worry that we complain about them too much and look at the alternative of pretending. If you pretend race doesn't exist, if you are officially colorblind, then what you're also pretending is racism doesn't exist, and the outcomes caused by racism doesn't exist, and that is washing your hands from reality.
Yeah. So go that extra mile, make sure we are kind of almost overemphasizing how we're including that and representing it, because therefore it's present and not absent.
Well, I mean, if I tick a certain acronym in a box, that's not an identity. It's a metric. And I think sometimes some things aren't identities. I mean, I thought the debate about BAME was people seeing it through the prism of identity. It's a metric. Now, we are going to need, and there's already one emerging, a metric for people who are visible minorities. So BAME has been discredited, but the new one is, as you will know, is MEG, minority ethnic groups. Because we're kind of going to need one. It's not an identity. And if it became an identity, then that's really problematic. But it's not an identity. And I don't think there's any box that's actually going to capture my identity. I'm a Nigerian Geordie. That's pretty damn specific. And if I saw that on a form, I think this company's spending far too much time thinking about every possibility. I think we need to distinguish between identity and the need to have metrics to try to analyse how toxic ideas are operating in our society. And I worry a lot less about those metrics than many people do.
Okay. I want to come, we've had a couple of questions come through on the Slido. Are you optimistic that a new approach to analysing the past and looking at it through a different lens, and what we hope will be potentially a less misty-eyed view of national myths, are you optimistic that that is making meaningful change?
I am. I'm optimistic for one reason, because young people, for reasons nobody has been able to explain, seem to have an innate relationship with the past, which is profoundly different to their parents and their grandparents. Nobody can tell me why. I've asked every historian I know. I was talking to somebody in a heritage organisation, a very major heritage organisation, and they were saying the cliche now is that the multi-generational family will go to the stately home, and the grandparents and the parents will want to wander through the rooms and look at the decor and the paintings, and then go and have inevitably scones at the gift shop. And that the kids are on their phones looking it up on Google to see where the money came from. And they get the old maxim behind every great fortune is a great crime, because they're not looking for this as a form of entertainment. They don't expect history to make them feel warm and fluffy. And I think it's not just that a new understanding of history is emerging, a new relationship with history is emerging by a generation who just don't see history as naturally recreation. And that idea that history exists to give us warm, fluffy feelings, that it's a form of recreation, I think that is generationally fading away, and that creates the capacity for us to have a much more frank and open relationship with our past.
Interesting. I guess building on that and kind of looking at that, slightly kind of moving away from warm and fluffy, is there a correlation between anti-globalization and increased patriotism to an increase in racist rhetoric?
I think there absolutely is, but I think again that is created by the most powerful technologies that we've ever seen that we don't know how to manage. I always think about the period from 2011 onwards. It's fascinating to look at newspaper reports from 2011 and the Arab Spring, because the subtext to much of that journalism was that these new technologies, Twitter and Facebook, were going to bring down tyrannies, that they were going to unleash a new enhanced form of democracy. Well, we ended that decade with Mark Zuckerberg in front of the Congress, and books being written that suggested that these technologies not only didn't enhance democracy, that they were perhaps inimical and incompatible with democracy. We are up against algorithms of a sophistication we've never seen before, an understanding of human nature and a manipulation of human nature. I mean, Yuval Noah Harari puts it best, that we've hacked human beings. We understand how our minds work. If you've read Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, I mean, she tells a story about that Amazon is able to tell when women are pregnant before they are because of the things that they buy. This is absolutely astonishing. So I think we need to recognize that people who are trapped in that network of misinformation and disinformation I think we should view them as people who have become trapped in a world of other forms of addiction. I think it is a trap, and we need to, I think, have a certain amount of empathy for that misinformation is an addictive substance.
And how do we address, because actually we talk a lot about the idea that people live within their own bubbles and they are influenced by what they see and the social media world, the kind of algorithms that drive their content. How do we get people to see a world outside that and to move forward from kind of something to kind of have some counter to that point of view, a counter narrative to what we're seeing?
Well, I think we talk about living in a world of overstimulated by too much information. I think if we actually analyze what's information and what's opinion, I think we realize that a huge amount of what this tsunami of data that swamps people's minds and their feeds is actually opinion. I mean, GB News is not a news channel. It's a misnomer. It's a miscategorization. It's an opinion channel. And opinion is cheap. I mean, the reason why the phone-in emerged as a form of radio is not because people who run radio programs really care what you think. It's because it's much cheaper than going out and making programs. Journalism is really expensive. Opinion is really, really cheap. And most of what drowns out the rest of our society is opinion. And it is so ubiquitous that it is almost to the point that we forget what is opinion, and we're not great at determining it. If you think about your favorite newspaper, I bet you can name the opinion columnists above the journalists. Now, I am an opinion columnist. And when I think about the newspapers I write for, the names of the opinion writers are more vivid than the names of the journalists. That's enormously problematic. And I don't think we've fully recognized it. There is too much information. It is incredibly difficult to grasp the complexity of our society. The ubiquity, the capacity to find out anything, anywhere through a device in your hand is astonishing. But it's made far more complicated by the fact that much of what comes into that device in your hand is not news. It's not information, it's opinion, which is cheap, it's easily generated, and it's easily monetized.
Given that a lot of our role in the jobs that we do is about making sure we are bringing context and representing the voices of people and having more of a universal point of view, how can we challenge that in ourselves then? How can we make sure that we are anchoring more of what we do in fact and information and not opinion?
Well, I think an awful lot of the metrics that are understood in our society are the metrics of opinion. I think we talk far more about opinion polls than we do about the metrics of our economy. And news and the industries I work in have been complicit in this. If you think about the balance of trade, go back to read books about even the 70s and the 80s. Politicians would war game what they were going to do when the balance of trade figures came out. Politicians in power would try to manipulate the time of elections to avoid the balance of trade figures coming out. We don't even report the balance of trade figures anymore. They are not deemed to be worthy of news anymore. We live in this world. It's not just that opinion is privileged over news. We know more about what each other, and even in different groups and different bubbles, what we think than what we are and what we have or don't have. We don't know each other's material conditions, but we know what we think. This is how myths like the idea of that the average Brexit voter was somebody in a council estate in the north. It wasn't. It was somebody above average income, predominantly in the south. Because we are more interested in opinion than fact. That even shapes, we're more interested in each other's opinions than the material realities of our lives. There's too much polling and not enough analysis would be my take.
I think that's a good challenge for the people in this room. We are unfortunately out of time. I literally could have spent another 2 hours here, and I'm sure everybody would have spent another 2 hours listening to you. David, thank you so much for coming and being part of our conference today. It's given us a lot of food for thought, and we really appreciate your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.